All right, I think that's been enough time to give folks some time to hop on there. So we'll get rolling. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our April edition of Science Cafe with the Conservation and Research Department at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. We're super excited this evening to have with us all the way from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, Dr. Karen Dematio, who will be presenting on using a multi-pronged bottom-up approach to conserve an endangered biodiversity hotspot, the Atlantic forest of Misiones, Argentina. Before we get started, just want to let folks know all of the participants are currently muted, and we just ask that you can remain muted for the rest of the presentation, please. We will have a question and answer section after the presentation. And we ask that you please direct those questions to the Q&A section of our interface. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, you should see a little button that says Q&A, and you can just go ahead and click on that and direct any questions you might have there. Other than that, I also want to let everyone know that we are recording this event tonight, and we will have this available for folks to listen to on our website. And you can also check out all of our previous presentations that we've had as well. And I will go ahead here in just a minute and share that address in the chat, and we will also have it available for you there at the end of the talk. But before we get started, I just want to go ahead and let you all know a little bit about Dr. Dematio and what she's been up to. So she is a biologist that has used a broad range of techniques to understand basic biology and ecological interactions that occur at both the species and community level. For the majority of the year, she can be found at Washington University in St. Louis teaching courses on the applications and use of GIS, or that's Geographic Information System software, for the Environmental Studies program. The rest of the year, she can be found applying these spatial mapping techniques and genetic analyses to data collected with conservation detection dogs in Misiones, Argentina. As co-director of Proyecto Zorro Pitico, in addition to the research focused at conserving the largest fragment of Atlantic forest, she is involved with directing hands-on training courses with Argentinian students, securing the participation of private landowners in the biological corridor, and supporting the anti-poaching efforts of provincial park guards. So without further ado, Karen, I give you the floor. Thank you, Dr. Dematio.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian. I am really excited to tell you a little bit about our project that, crazy enough, started 13, 14 years ago in Misiones with a small pilot study working with bush dogs, hence the name Proyecto Zorro Pitico, which is the Bush Dog Project. Since then, it has expanded into quite a massive project focused on conserving this biodiversity hotspot in Misiones. It's possible through a lot of collaborators, including my two main co-directors, who are Karina Arguellas and Miguel Renas, who are associated with the Ministry of Ecology, the universities and labs down there, as well as my associations with the St. Louis Zoo Wildcare Institute, as well as Washington University. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about our project, and I'd love to answer your questions at the end of anything I don't cover enough for you. So let's just start by talking about biodiversity hotspots and what we mean by them. Why do we care about these locations? And biodiversity hotspots are these biogeographic regions that have the richest and the most threatened reservoirs of plant and animal life on Earth. The concepts of biodiversity hotspots actually started over 3 decades ago, when just 10 tropical forests were identified as having serious levels of habitat loss and exceptional levels of plant endemism, meaning plants that existed nowhere else on Earth. To be considered a biodiversity hotspot means the area has to fit two strict criteria. They must contain at least 1,500 endemic vascular plants, and they must have lost at least 70% of their original surface area. Unfortunately, most biodiversity hotspots actually exceed these two criteria. So biodiversity hotspots today, there are actually 36 biodiversity hotspots. And these hotspots, while they once occupied almost 16% of the Earth's land surface, due to extreme habitat loss due to human activities, it's resulted in these areas currently occupying less than 2.5% of the Earth's land area. So a tremendous loss of these habitats. These 36 hotspots account for about 35% of what we call the world's ecosystem services. And these include things like drinking water, erosion control, climate regulation, nutrient cycle, and even recreation. These hotspots support about 50% of the global vascular plants, and they have extremely high levels of endemism, with about 40% of the vertebrate species considered endemic, or remember, not occurring anywhere else. These hotspots are also unique in that they have a high proportion of threatened species. They contain about 80% of the amphibians and about 65% of the birds, and about 65% of their mammals are considered threatened. However, they also contain about 2.1 billion people, and all of these people are dependent on these forests for their services. So we focused in the Atlantic forest, and the Atlantic forest is one of these biodiversity hotspots. It's a really unique ecoregion that is composed of a variety of biomes. And this includes both seasonal moist and dry broadleaf tropical forest, both tropical and subtropical grasslands, savannas, shrublands, and even mangrove forests. The Atlantic forest is incredibly rich in its biodiversity, with about 40% of its vascular plants, 60% of its vertebrates, 50% of its tree species, and 90% of its amphibians considered endemic or not found elsewhere. So within the Atlantic forest, about 90% of it is actually found in eastern Brazil, but it can actually extend down into eastern Paraguay and northeastern Argentina. Unfortunately, about 85% of the original area occupied by Atlantic forest has been deforested. This really threatens a lot of plants and animals with extinction. Unfortunately, this deforestation is ongoing, so that percentage of loss is only increasing. The majority of this deforestation is occurring in both Brazil and Paraguay. One of the largest contiguous remnants of Atlantic forest, about 3.5 million acres, can be found in Misiones, Argentina. To put this in perspective, this remnant of Atlantic forest in Misiones, Argentina is about the size of the state of Connecticut. The province of Misiones is unique. It is this tiny spit of land located in northeastern Argentina that's bordered by both Paraguay and Brazil. It's probably best known for Iguazu Falls, which is considered one of the new 7 wonders of the world. They are a set of waterfalls on the Iguazu River between the borders of Argentina and Brazil. Together, they actually make up the largest waterfall system in the world. It's pretty incredible. The province of Misiones is small, it's tiny. In fact, it occupies only 1% of the total area of Argentina. However, Misiones was actually declared the national capital of biodiversity for Argentina. It's a declaration that recognizes it actually contains 40% of the country's biodiversity. While almost half of Misiones remains forested, which is pretty incredible considering the growing population in one of the poorest provinces in Argentina, only half of that is actually located in a series of protected areas. Each of these protected areas is really at risk of becoming an isolated island of native forest, this Atlantic forest, surrounded by human-modified habitat due to ongoing land conversion, human expansion, roads, things along those lines. The forest that's outside of these protected areas is in a really complex mosaic of different habitat types. It includes monocultural stands of both pine and eucalyptus, small-scale agricultural with perennial crops of both tea and yerba mate, areas of subsistence agriculture, pastures that are typically dominated by African grasses, highly invasive, and urban areas. The human infrastructure can also be seen by an expanding network of roads across the region, many of those going from dirt to high velocity paved roads. In 1999, the government of Misiones actually legally formed what's called the Green Corridor, with the goal to protect this Atlantic forest of Misiones. However, the Green Corridor has largely remained on paper with really little on-the-ground legal reinforcement. This means that native forest is being lost as human populations continue to expand across the region. Our goal in this project was to use a multi-pronged, bottom-up approach to help make the Green Corridor reality. Our project, Proyecto Zoropitoco, has 5 main components: biodiversity surveys, an interaction program with landowners, education outreach program, a protection program focused on illegal hunting and logging, and local training. Biodiversity surveys were the first component, with the aim to determine the optimal area for a biological corridor between these protected areas that exist in the northern and central zone of Misiones. This biological corridor would help mitigate some of those current threats to connectivity in the region, including minimizing additional habitat conversion from, say, forests to pastures, and maximizing the retention of unprotected forest. Both of these would actually act to reduce the potential of all of these protected areas becoming those isolated islands of intact habitat, intact Atlantic forest, surrounded by modified habitat. However, what species do you focus on for these biodiversity surveys? And how do you collect the data across such an immense area with a tremendous variation in the types of habitat, the degree of protection provided to that habitat, and even the presence of humans? We decided to not focus on a single species, but instead multiple species. So our initial surveys focused on 5 wide-ranging carnivores: the jaguar, puma, ocelot, oncilla, and bush dog. These 5 carnivores vary almost 10 times in their body size, and they also have a lot of differences in their ecological requirements, what they need to survive. However, they also share a lot of characteristics. So if we collect data from these 5 different carnivores, it would actually allow us to model a biological corridor that would capture this breadth of ecological needs across these 5 different species versus being restricted to a single species. So how do you collect the data? To collect the data, our goal was to use a non-invasive technique. So that meant we wanted to eliminate the need to actually physically capture the animals. This became really important because we weren't working on one species, we wanted to focus on 5 species. So there are a lot of multiple standard techniques that wildlife surveys can use. And these include things like transects, walking along a line and counting things, tracking stations, figuring out what walks through an area, hair snares, capturing samples of DNA through hair snares, or even camera traps. Prior to this study in the region of Misiones, the majority of the data had been collected with camera traps. Most of us are probably familiar with camera traps because they're exploding across everyone's backyards across the world. So it's an easy way to capture what's passing through your backyard. However, technique of camera traps does not work with all species. Some species will actually actively avoid where you put a camera trap. So along a main road or in an open area, some species will avoid those areas, meaning you won't capture their photo. You won't know that they're actually present there. Camera traps have other limitations, including the fact it's not always possible to differentiate individuals or confirm the sex of an individual. The lack of this information can actually affect the ability to develop effective management strategies. So if your animal has spots, yes, you could probably identify individuals, but you may not be able to tell the sex. If it's just a plain coated animal, you may not be able to tell sex or individuals. In addition, in Misiones, the use of camera traps outside of protected areas is extremely difficult due to theft of equipment. Your cameras walk away. That's a problem for this study because we aim at understanding that connection between existing protected areas in the northern central zone. So we want to survey outside of protected areas. So we removed that need to try to attract it to a specific location. We decided we don't want to try to attract them to a trail, an open area, a specific location with camera traps. And we decided to switch to locating evidence that the animal leaves behind during its natural movement. Scat, poop. Yes, we're all talking about that today. So it is amazing what you can learn from Scat. Scat means that we are focusing on locating evidence that the species leaves during its natural movement and behavior. So we're not modifying the movement or behavior of those animals. We're just picking up what they've left behind. Scat's been used for decades to address basic ecological questions. However, all of these studies depend on accurately identifying the species who left the sample. So in our case, how do you tell a large puma versus a small jaguar? They're going to look really similar, and identifying those differently makes a big deal. So advances in genetic techniques actually have eliminated the need for potential misidentification of samples. We're able to extract DNA from the scat. Specifically, we can use the intestinal cells left on the outside of the scat as it passes through the donor system to extract DNA. That extracted DNA, plus a variety of different genetic analyses, can allow us to confirm which species it came from, but also identify the individual and the sex of that individual. All of that from something a species leaves behind as it walks through its daily movements. We can then use this GIS technology, a type of spatial analysis that allows you to relate things to each other, to combine that genetic information plus the GPS location that we collected in the field, the physical location of where it was. When these data are combined and we add additional information such as habitat or human presence, we can then start determining things like habitat use. We can identify areas of potential conflict, and we can model those biological corridors we want. So we know Scat can provide us a lot of information, basic ecological information, and even beyond that, but how do you find the Scat? Depending on the species, the habitat, the terrain, it can be a big challenge. In Misiones, we needed to cover a very large area. We needed to cross a variety of different habitats, and we needed to focus on 5 different species. That's a big challenge. So we decided to use detection dogs. It's a technique that just takes advantage of the extraordinary sense of smell for the domestic dog. We're all familiar with domestic dogs. We're all familiar with detection dogs. Why? They've been used by the military and law enforcement agents for decades. You can't go through an airport these days without seeing a detection dog. Conservation has just taken these techniques and transferred them to finding samples for targeted species. It's an odor. For the dog, it's an odor. The types of samples are really varied, and they include things like scat, but also rare or difficult to locate species, even ivory, invasive or noxious plants, and even invasive insects. Their application is growing. The number of habitats, environments that it's being applied to is constantly growing. Detection dogs are trained to use their natural ability to reliably and repeatedly locate a particular scent or multiple scents on command. These dogs are trained using a passive alert to their handler, which means no touching, no barking. When they find a sample, they alert to finding that sample. These finds are rewarded with playtime, typically a tennis ball. I have yet to find a human field assistant that is willing to work for this type of reward. There are so many advantages to working with an olfactory-based search image versus our visual-based search image. Dogs are able to cover an extremely large geographic area much more efficiently and faster. Dogs are able to locate multiple target species and essentially ignore those non-targets. So they don't have to look at every sample. Their nose is saying yes or no. With dogs, sample discrimination is not affected by the visual appearance of that sample. So it doesn't matter if it's old or fresh, it's large, it's small, it doesn't matter. It's the odor it's finding that sample based on. With dogs, it's able to pinpoint the location independent of sample exposure. So the sample can be under the ground, it can be in a hole, it can be in grass. The dog allows you to find it. So it removes it opens the door to be able to find samples that aren't just located on the road, but samples located all over the habitat. This is exactly what we needed in this study. So what did we find with Train? He's our Chesapeake Bay Retriever that was rescued from a humane society in Washington State. His ball drive and high energy is what got him adopted. And while he failed 3 different narcotic classes, in 2009, he found his calling in the world of conservation. Train's like so many other conservation detection dogs in that they have extremely high energy, they are extremely obsessive, which makes them the perfect detection dog. In the first 3 field seasons, we covered about 800 miles, which means Train covered probably 2,400 miles because he covers 2 to 3 times what we do. And we collected more than 900 high quality scats. We collected many more than that, but they weren't always high quality where we could get DNA from them. These data represent the first comprehensive study of its kind in the region for a variety of habitats surveyed and for the amount of data collected outside of protected areas. We were able to collect data on the largest species, such as jaguar and puma, but we were also on the most exclusive and rare, such as the bush dog. All of this was made possible because we had a 4-legged field assistant. We took all of these scats with their confirmed genetic identities, plus the locations where we found them in the field, and to model our multi-species biological corridor. So in general, what we did was we took this data from the field, We combined it with information on habitat integrity. Was it native forest? Was it fragmented pasture? What type of area was it? And then human proximity. Were we next to a town or far from a town? Were we on a farm or far from farms? All of that was included to model the corridor to actually determine a corridor that maximized animal movement across this landscape and minimized the potential for human-wildlife conflict. This generated a biological corridor that contains about 1 million acres, which is equal to an area about the size of the state of Rhode Island. The corridor has the potential to almost double the amount of protected area in these northern central zone of Misiones. The corridor crosses a variety of habitats, including plantations, agriculture, and human-occupied areas. We were able to identify areas of high species richness and extremely high habitat integrity, so really good forested areas, but also those that need more oversight to prevent additional forest loss, as well as some areas that probably need restoration. So we did what all researchers do. You must publish that work, right? So we published it, and we provided a work that talked about this multi-species biological corridor that could conserve multiple carnivores, as well as all of the biodiversity that existed with them. Many conservation projects stop at this point, and they basically hand the results over to the government and say, here you go. We knew, though, if we did that, we would be back to where we were, like the Green Corridor. It would remain on paper and never become a reality. So what we wanted to do was figure out how can we actually make this a reality and conserve this Atlantic forest we were trying to protect. First, we wanted to test our model. We had a lot of data from this modeled biological corridor, but we wanted to go back and test in some of the areas that we identified to have the most fragmentation, the lowest habitat integrity, and those areas that were predicted to have the lowest species richness. Did it hold for those areas? Did we need to make adjustments to it? The second is we wanted to expand the model to include game species that these 5 carnivores consider extremely important, but also are often heavily targeted by poachers. We figured without prey, there's no carnivores. So understanding what's happening at this broader level was extremely important. So we focused on the tapir, the white-lipped peccary, collared peccary, and paca. For the dogs, no big deal. It just means more samples, which means more playtime with their tennis ball. In the 2 surveys we did, we covered almost 600 miles and learned a lot. We found all species independent of parcel size. So if we look at those sizes of parcels, the way they're divided by ownership, we had things less than 250 acres to those that were greater than 250,000 acres. We determined that even the largest species, the jaguar, the puma, the tapir, could occur on areas that were highly fragmented and had humans present. These findings suggested that management needed to be based on habitat integrity, how fragmented or not fragmented it was, and not the size of the parcel. So those parcel boundaries did not matter, of course, to the animals. It was essential then to figure out ways to balance human presence with biodiversity if this corridor was going to become a reality. This was essential as it's really unrealistic to think that the area could be purchased and made into a protected area. Instead, it was really clear we needed to figure out how we could work with landowners to find ways to live off the land as well as live with the biodiversity. The people were not going anywhere. So this brings us to our second component of Proyecto Zoropitoco, which is the Corridor Interaction Program, which was initiated in 2018. This program aims to use one-on-one interactions with the landowners in the corridor to secure their participation in the corridor by hearing their concerns, addressing their questions, and really finding solutions to their issues. This was extremely important because 60% of this corridor is actually privately owned. Currently, there are 2 full-time park guards, Tomás Francés and Victor Soleil, working for the program. And while National Geographic, a Big Cat Initiative grant, funded the initial formation of this program in the first year of expenses, the Ministry of Ecology has since assumed responsibility for the majority of this program's expenses. And that's really major because it means that the provincial government believes in its efforts and is invested in its on-the-ground work to make this biological corridor a reality, meaning making the green corridor a reality, protecting that Atlantic forest. In the first year, the team secured 35% of the participation of the corridor in those private properties, and this proportion has been steadily increasing since then. The team also identified properties that were interested in a tax incentive, that is a reduction in their taxes for maintaining the forest intact. We are currently working with the local municipalities across the province to commit that these tax reductions become a reality. We're also working to generate a series of interactive workshops that the team identified as essential in those areas that are most fragmented in the corridor. And these interactive workshops would promote things like locally driven economic incentives, so things like organic gardens, captive breeding of paca, and even beekeeping. It would improve the quality of their land, which would be promoting reforestation, slope restoration, and improving and protecting waterways. And finally, improving the health and living conditions of the persons through modifications of their livestock management and sustainable land practices. Those that are living in the most fragmented area are the lowest economic status, so providing these alternatives and these help to kind of shift their quality of living will have a good long-term effect of ensuring the quality of the land within the corridor. The goal is to secure 100% of the corridor, and we are getting close to that. We're not there yet, but we're getting close. However, we realize this is not over once we check the box of we've secured 100%, because it's going to be an ongoing effort to address concerns that come up, deal with land ownership changes, or even challenges we didn't expect to come up along the way. So the real goal is to maintain these persons on the ground long-term and for the corridor interaction program to become fully incorporated into the Ministry of Ecology on all levels. Closely linked to this corridor interaction program is our third component, which is an education outreach to the schools throughout the corridor. Since 2010, the project's been working with the local educators throughout the corridor to kind of teach and talk about the biodiversity in their backyards, right? How people can actually help to conserve that biodiversity that's in their backyards and why that biodiversity in Misiones is so important. Over the years, this program has expanded to include multiple park guards that travel to the schools throughout the corridor to teach about biodiversity, conservation, and the biological corridor. And they use this combination of games and activities and different discussions to get the students involved. We're also currently working with the Ministry of Education to have these materials and concepts incorporated in their annual program across all of Misiones, so both inside and outside of the corridor. Our fourth component of the program is a direct result of what we learned during our biodiversity surveys. We learned first that on-the-ground work was essential to secure the corridor, and we needed to work with those privately owned lands. But we also learned in our field surveys that poaching was having a severe negative effect on wildlife. And we saw that if nothing was done, there were actually areas of forest in Misiones that were at risk of becoming what we called dead forest. Yes, there would be beautiful Atlantic forests still in existence, but there would be no biodiversity living within it. So the wildlife would be exterminated. In 2018, using these data we collected from our field surveys in 2016 and 2018, we actually worked with the Ministry of Ecology to legally form a group of park guards tasked with patrols and arrests of persons poaching wildlife and illegally harvesting native forest. The risks of these teams they take is extremely real, with extended travels into really remote areas of Misiones to find the persons that are armed and are not afraid to fire at park guards. It is important to note something. Misiones, there is no legal hunting. It is poaching if you take an animal. And the majority of native trees are technically legally protected by the Green Quarter designation. So while hunting and logging definitely has a cultural origin within Misiones, it's also driven by the extremely poor economic situation facing the region right now. In addition, because the province sits on the border of Brazil, there are many who cross from Brazil to hunt in Misiones, where a lot of the legal repercussions are sometimes lower, and there are definitely more fauna still present. So Proyectos Oropitoco has worked to help these efforts for anti-poaching and anti-logging by providing tactical and logistical support to these teams. Prior, these teams were never really respected. They weren't given the support. They kind of just went out with whatever gear they had and made it work. Their dedication was amazing. So what we tried to do was improve their situation and give more recognition to their work. So we started providing things like tactical backpacks, tents and mattresses, even field laptops, GPS units, satellite radios, night vision goggles, bulletproof vests, yes, extremely important, truck winches, roll bars, even trailer hitches, and even supplemental gas. So all of those things that allow their work to occur more safely and more efficiently. What's incredible is these efforts got compounded by the impact of Ministry of Ecology stepping forward and upping what they provided also. And they've actually increased the number of new vehicles provided to those teams, as well as increasing the number of personnel. There's also ongoing efforts to change the levels of personal insurance these guys have. It's incredible. It's really not present. And the other are the salaries for these teams, to recognize that going out and risking your life to save the wildlife is much more valuable than sitting and guarding a park guard station. So recognizing the effort they're putting in financially. The last component, but definitely not the least important, is the training that we are trying to do to create that next generation of conservationists in Misiones. And local training has really been central to our project since its initiation in 2007 with our pilot study. It provides practical hands-on training, and this includes things like training in field logistics, with all of our field assistants being from local universities. Courses in handling detection dogs, with several studies starting from dogs that are currently living in Argentina and working on projects. Training in genetic techniques, with several students actually completing their undergraduate thesis with data from this study, and GIS courses, including basic modeling and even advanced analyses. The project has also worked to expand the resources available at Higa Laboratory, which is the genetic lab in Misiones where the majority of genetic processing is now occurring. But we aren't stopping there. We're actually continuing our work. So while we continue to make this northern central corridor a reality, working on the ground with landowners, we're also working to expand the corridor into the central southern zone. It's an area that has tremendous land transformation occurring. The human population is expanding really day by day. But we also have very little baseline data from there. There are almost no studies exploring what is present or absent there. So doing this would help expand this corridor, the protection of this green corridor in Misiones, but it would also fulfill a request from the provincial government, who actually asked the project to do this expansion into the central southern zone. This work will actually be driven by two local graduate students, Orlando Escalante and Delfina Sotores. As with all of our biodiversity surveys, we'll be using detection dogs, genetic analyses of Scat, and also GIS technology with the goal to model a multi-species biological corridor for this central southern zone. It's estimated we'll add an additional 600,000 acres to the corridor that's existing in the northern central zone. Long term, the goal is to have Delfina in Orlando the go-to people for both monitoring and expanding this corridor long term, and also to have Tomas and Victor work with these landowners in the central southern region to secure their participation in the corridor. So in just over a decade, Proyecto Oro Pitoco has come a really long way. We started as a research project with just a few players trying to see if detection dogs would work, and everyone's like, you're crazy, to actually developing it into a project that's owned by the province of Misiones. The project was actually recently adopted by the province as a project of regional importance by the House of Representatives in Misiones. It was also a project that's been adopted by the Ministry of Ecology as the project that can help fight climate change for Misiones. In fact, in 2017, the government presented it as their project at COP23 in Bonn, Germany. So the Green Corridor is really close to finally becoming a reality after 2 decades of sitting on paper. So while we in Proyecto Oro Pitoco focused on one of the 36 biodiversity hotspots, the human footprint is touching all over the world, hence 36 biodiversity hotspots. So we believe that the techniques we're using, detection dogs, genetic analyses of Scat, and GIS technology can be applied to any other ecosystem where connectivity across the landscape is threatened. And using this multi-prong, going from many different avenues and bottom up, getting the local people involved in making it become their project is really something that can serve as a model for other regions in the world. So I've only touched on a really small part of this project, and it would be impossible to say this project is even going forward without a collaboration of so many people and agencies. And there are so many to mention. It would be a whole other presentation to do. And that includes all of our international funding sources that have made all aspects of this project, from the corridor interaction to education to biodiversity surveys to protection. All of that has been possible through so many funding sources. So with that, I will be happy to take any of your questions, and thank you so much for your time and attention to my presentation, and I would love to address any questions. Back to you, Ian.
Wow, Karen, that was amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's just such a, so complex, and looking at what you've done with, using GIS technology and detection dogs and genetic analysis, and then just all the community engagement. I'm so impressed. And it's obvious that you've spent a lot of time you know, working on this and just so well thought out. It's
Well,
very
what
impressive.
started as a crazy idea blossomed into something really massive. And
Yeah.
it's pretty exciting to see from our aspect, the government really adopt this. And that was the goal from the start. And to see them actually do that has just been amazing.
So I just want to let folks know, feel free to start typing in questions there into the Q&A section, and we'll just give folks a couple of minutes to think up some questions. And there again, just put them in the question and answer section. And also, I was thinking, if folks want to learn more about what you're doing, do you have a website or any kind of social media presence or anything where they can learn more about this?
Our biggest social media is at the top of this, so got Scat. So like got milk, but we've got Scat. So on our Facebook page, we've got, we try to post pretty regularly, especially when we're in the field, what's going on. So got Scat is our Facebook page.
Okay, I'm gonna share that in the chat right now. There we go.
Oh, so I do you want me to answer that question that's posted?
No, I just saw that. I can read those too.
Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
I'll read them so everybody can hear. So this is from an anonymous attendee, and they say, amazing talk and project. Thanks for sharing. It looks like there is more altered habitat in the southern zone. Will restoration play a role in this new phase of the project? And if so, any thoughts on what kind of restoration techniques might be used?
Yes, well, thank you for the kind words. And also for restoration, yes, it'll be a big part of the project. So in the Northern Central Zone, we're kind of starting that. There's actually several foundations and agencies who work actively with restoration. So we're not going to try to recreate the wheel. We're going to link in with them to link into the properties that need that. That will also be part of our tax incentives and tax reductions, is to promote the restoration and allow landowners to do that. There's actually a lot of resources in Misiones of different agencies growing native plants and helping with the restoration of those native plants and trees. So it should be, it definitely will be a major effort. Along with that will be slope and waterways that have definitely been affected, as well as changing the management of livestock. That's a big issue because they tend to, in some areas, allow the livestock to just go into the forest, which is extremely devastating, and trying to change those management strategies. So yeah, it'll be on multiple levels to change that.
Good. And we have a question from Randall Martin, who asks, would the program purchase the connection corridor, or do the landowners just allow animals to wander through?
So they actually, that's part of our participation, agreeing to allow the animals to wander through the corridor, to agree with that. We do have these areas that are like connectors that are highly fragmented areas, and those tend to have lots of tiny properties. And those areas we're working on restoration and a lot of education and changing land management so that the animals are allowed to move through those. So that's part of this agreement to participate in the corridor, is to allow the animals to go through there. To purchase it would be practically impossible financially, and those people aren't going anywhere. A problem in Misiones is there's a lot of illegal occupation also, a lot of squatters on land, and so that's another issue that we're trying to work through with our people on the ground.
This question is from Sylvia Alvarez Clare, who asks, what are you proposing as alternatives to letting the livestock roam in the forest? We have the same issue in Mexico.
Yeah, it's a devastating thing to see what cattle can do to a forest. it just clears out all of the underground vegetation and the animals just scatter. And you worry about the problem of the interaction between wildlife and domestic animals, and disease transfer between those animals is another issue, especially between pigs and peccaries. And so with our ideas, some of the local experts that would be running those interaction programs are more of a corral system, closer to a specific area of the house where it would be. There would definitely be a part of the forest or pasture that would be allowed to be used, but not this open range, which technically isn't allowed anyways, but is occurring. So it would be much more of a controlled system, fencing or electric fencing to keep the animals out of the forest and into a more centralized area.
Okay, we have another question from an anonymous attendee. They say, great talk, and the study certainly has applications for regions in the United States. Is human population expanding in Misiones as a result of immigration and or because of local population growth? And is there a role for empowering women to reduce population growth?
So interesting question. I would say it's a result of both. Immigration from both Paraguay and Brazil, because it's surrounded by those two countries, as well as population growth locally with growing families. The other issue within Misiones is that it's not just the problem with the population growth and expansion is it's literally expanding into what we would consider like suburbs, but it's expanding into these forested areas because everybody kind of wants their little piece of paradise. And so they're expanding into these forested areas, and their first thing they do is chop down the forest and create a pasture or create a garden and build a house. It's probably a combination of both. In terms of the role of women, it would probably, I think women can be empowered most by some of our workshops to empower them to create more sustainable economic solutions or management solutions for their land, so that instead of using a lot of pesticides on the land to generate the food for their family, doing organic garden or paca breeding or beekeeping to be able to not only support their family, but generate economic incentives also. So using a combination of things where we can improve the health and living of the people, because they're extremely poor, some of these people, very low economic status. They are truly living off the land. But as they live off the land, they degrade the quality of the land, which means it gets them even less down the road. So trying to improve their standard and provide an economic incentive would, I think, help empower the women as well as the families in general in those areas. If I answered that.
Yeah, I think that was a good answer. We have a question from Freya Harris, who asks, what in your view is the best way to preserve biodiversity?
I think it's complicated, isn't it? That's kind of what we're doing in this project. Yeah. I would say, we started looking at carnivores and we started thinking about preserving the habitat. Then we started thinking about, well, you really need the prey, but then you really need the people to play along with it. And so the problem with conservation in general is it's so many people and components that play into actually making it successful. It's not just saying I want to conserve the jaguar, because the jaguar depends on so many other things. It needs to cross an enormous area where people may be living, and it depends on the forest that exists around that area. So it really, to me, to conserve the biodiversity really requires this multi-pronged approach that we're using. You have to understand what's present, you have to understand the threats, and then you have to work with the people on the ground to implement that change. Because if they don't believe in it and they don't buy into it, they won't do it. And one of the things we found in Misiones was our team on the ground could open up doors that the government shut. So they had previously been talked to about the green corridor, and they were like, shh, we don't want the government to touch us. But when we explained it from a project side and what we could get them and what we could work with them, then they started being interested in that. They started being interested of, oh, could I create a private reserve? Oh, can I get a tax reduction? Oh, I'll keep my forest. What's in it for me? And so they started seeing benefits from the backside of what we wanted, conserve biodiversity, but for them, they got a benefit out of it. So I think it's that balance of both.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So when you were approaching these people, do you speak Spanish pretty well? Like, or did you have folks with you that were kind of helping you out with that? Are other Argentinians or locals?
I did speak Spanish. So I learned Spanish in high school. I didn't speak it for a number of years. Went to Paraguay, started speaking it again. Went to Brazil for almost a year, switched to Portuguese. Showed up in Argentina speaking more Portuguese than Spanish, but it's okay. They understand Portuguese because we're on the border. And gradually I've switched back to Spanish, but most people think I'm from Brazil because I have a very strong Brazilian accent when I speak my Spanish. So they know I'm a foreigner, but they most often presume I'm from Brazil. And then when they learn I'm from the United States, they're like, what? So they know I'm a foreigner, that I don't speak like a Misiones person, but they assume I'm from Brazil and not from the United States usually.
That's neat. So we have another question from Connor Morozumi, who asks, were you surprised at the densities that you were finding scat, especially in the areas that are not in protection currently? Also, I am currently teaching my dog how to find morel mushrooms. He's terrible at it. Got any tips? That's a good one. I like that.
That's good. So actually the numbers of scats, especially in unprotected areas, we were really surprised. And one of the things we saw, because we were collecting over multiple years, and this is how we started to identify poaching issues and other potential issues among the wildlife, where we were actually able to track declines in certain things or complete absence of certain things in different areas. And so in some unprotected areas, even some pine plantations, we would find incredible biodiversity, which we were like, really? Okay, we didn't think they'd exist here. And then we go to other areas that seemed to be really good forests, but it was a heavily poached area and we weren't finding anything in those areas. So in an unprotected area, what was unprotected would sometimes even be surprising in that it was unprotected and there was a ton, or it was unprotected and there was nothing. So yeah, we were pretty surprised, and we knew we could trust the dogs. So if there was nothing, there was nothing. And that was the amazing thing about it. With morels, oh, that's a tough one. I always joke I should have trained my dog to find morels because they're all over the place in Northwest Nebraska where we do cougar surveys. So, really? You know, we picked up bagfuls of them there. But I always joked I should train my dog. But I would say you need to find good morels to train your dog, and then get a good positive reinforcement that they really like to be able to do it. But some dogs have that drive and attention to do it, and some are like, I'd rather go and smell whatever. So it could be he's just not interested in morels, unfortunately for you.
Yeah, so far I like to hunt morels this time of year as well, and so far my dog Woody has not been very helpful in finding new patches, but he's still fun to have along.
There you go.
So we have a question from Ross Llewellyn, who asks, is there any coordination, like sharing techniques or strategies with similar groups doing conservation in other areas, countries, or continents?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we've actually talked with a number of different groups, plus our publications that just gets the information out there. We've also, the government is very interested in working with both Paraguay and Brazil on the edges of us, and they've talked with the government and starting to open that collaboration to be able to apply these techniques on just the regional level on a larger scale. Within the country, we share everything with the government, and then we try to publish as much as we can to share it with other groups around the world and get the information out that way. So yeah, we definitely try to maximize getting the information out there.
Cool. I'm not seeing any other questions, but I actually have one. So you
Sure.
had said that certain species that you're working with seem to evade the wildlife cameras. I was just curious which ones were usually the ones doing that.
Bush dogs are number one probably.
Wow. So they
Bush
just
dogs,
know
they
somehow. Yeah.
Bush dogs are amazing. You can set a trap out for them and they will walk all around the traps that you've set out and not go in them. You can catch bush dogs on camera traps, but people who are working in areas where we know there are bush dogs, there have been sightings of bush dogs, so we know they exist there. They have thousands, tens of thousands of camera trap photos and maybe have one bush dog. And so what we found when we did a radio collared study with them in Brazil was that bush dogs, unlike jaguars and pumas and a lot of cats that walk the main roads, bush dogs cross the road. They don't walk along the main road. And it could be because a jaguar is much bigger than them. And they're little tiny, 5 kilogram animals. So they aren't very big. And so those animals tend to cross and they're much harder to find. Jaguars, pumas, most of the others you could probably capture. But even when you get into like pumas, it's hard to tell individuals because they all look the same. Unless you've got a special near ear clip or a tail kink or something like that, it's hard to tell individuals apart from those. So yeah, bush dogs are probably the hardest, which is what got us into detection dogs in the first place.
Yeah. We've got a question from Diana Farmer who asks, do NGOs that provide livestock to poor individuals make problems worse? And then they say like, i.e. Heifer International.
So interesting. I would say, and I'm not sure in Argentina how much of it occurs that way. And I'm not sure how much of those NGOs help with the livestock management on the backside or help financially with the livestock management or setup of that. And that would be the biggest question. That part I'm not 100% sure of how to answer for Misiones itself. I would say some of the largest cattle producers or pig producers within Misiones tend to come from more money versus those that have just a couple are much smaller farms that have kind of this small baseline maintenance of it. So yeah, I'm not sure how many are coming from NGOs like that within Misiones as much as they have one or two within their family kind of thing. So I'm not 100% sure on that.
Great. And again, I think we're about ready to wrap up, but if anyone has any more questions, feel free to shoot one out because we can definitely get another one or two in as long as you're okay with that, Dr.
I'm
Dematio.
fine. No, you're good.
So I do have just one more thing I was kind of curious about is like, at what point did you decide like, hey, maybe we can use dogs, like detection dogs for this? Like, was it kind of a no-brainer, or was it like there was an aha moment? Or
no, it was kind of more of an aha and a lot of frustration in the field moment. I had tried attracting bush dogs using vocalization and urine and tracking stations in Paraguay, had a little success, but realized the unique thing about Bush dogs they cover these enormous home ranges equal to like a jaguar. So they cover these enormous areas, but they aren't like a jaguar because they cover little areas. They're semi-nomadic. They move all over the place. And so it's hard to set up a technique in one area and capture that species. I had done radio collars with them in Brazil, and realized you can capture them once and you can never capture them again. Like, it's really hard to capture bush dogs. They just know you're there. They come out of their dens and they look up in the tree and they look directly at you. And you're like, how do you know I'm here? But they know you're there. And so it became this species of kind of obsession to try to understand and study them. But one of the things we'd notice is they'd leave their little underground dens and poop in front of the den. And we're like, we just collect that and we could learn about bush dogs. And then I started learning about detection dogs at conferences and things like that. And I was like, I want to use detection dogs. And then it was a matter of everyone's like, that's a really good idea. You try that and you let me know how that works. And I was like, okay. Like, everybody wanted to study them and everyone thought it was a great idea, but they're like, you get back to me when that works. So it was a trial and doing a pilot study. And then from there it took off. So
yeah, seems like it's really worked. So
yeah, it's opened a lot of doors. It let us do like the first comprehensive survey, finding like 34 samples, different individuals in Misiones in 1 year. So pretty incredible.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any more questions, but again, thank you so much for
thank you.
taking time out of your, I'm sure, busy life to work with us and share your knowledge and what you're up to. It's so cool. I have a final screen I'm going to share here. I can pull it up. And all right. Yeah, so just want to thank everyone who's attended this evening again. We really appreciate everyone who comes out for these events, and it's been really, I think, fun to do it in the virtual format, because we get to have folks like Dr. Dematio clear from St. Louis, and just we're able to reach kind of a cast a bigger net in terms of who we can get to come and speak. So that's been really fun. And if you'd like to listen to this recording later, or if you have a friend that maybe wasn't able to make it tonight, we will go ahead and post this on our website. Should be up within probably 3 days to a week. And we have our website there, our URL for our Science Cafe, so you can always go ahead and click on that. And you can also see about future webinars that we'll be having. Speaking of which, our next webinar will be Thursday, May 20th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as always, with Dr. Carolina Hayduke from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And she will be presenting on some of her investigations into the evolution of CAM photosynthesis in plants. So that should be a lot of fun. And I should have some more information up about that talk on the website here within the next couple of weeks. And as always, if anybody has any questions or suggestions or thoughts on maybe somebody you think might want to speak at our future Science Cafe, go ahead and direct any of that to my email address at isabo@atlantabg.org. And as always, you can follow us on Instagram at AtlantaBG Conservation. And again, thanks for everyone to come out.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Awesome. Thank you.